Hi, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of Don't Die. This time I'm bringing to you the first half of my conversation with Schell, a game developer and academic. We spoke on October 5th, 2015. If you'd like to read a full transcript of this conversation, you can check the link down below in the description, and also down there you'll see a link to my Patreon where your support helps me continue with this project. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. No, my name is Jesse Schell. I am 45 years old. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And what was the last part?
What's your experience with the game industry for people who may not have a context for who you are?
Got it, right. And in terms of experience with the game industry, wow, let's see. I started making games as an amateur in probably about 1982, and started professionally probably about 1995. I had a lot of experience initially at the Walt Disney Company. I was in the Disney Virtual Reality Studio working on Disney Quest and other interactive theme park experiences. I was the lead designer on Toontown Online, which was one of the first MMOs for kids. In 2002, I started teaching at Carnegie Mellon, and I started Schell Games in Pittsburgh here, which initially was just me, and then I took on a few staff, and over the last 10, 12 years, we've grown it to a staff of about 100 people. And we've developed about 30 games over that time.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience with games academia. And I was talking to a colleague last week who was sort of wondering to me, and I realized you'd be a good person to ask this about. Do you get a sense that like games academia is siloed a little bit from, the bigger game companies in the industry? Like, is there a lot of communication between them?
There's some communication. So it all depends on what you mean by games academia. I would divide games academia into two categories. I would say there is, call it professional education, so education for the purpose of going into industry, and then there is the more kind of PhD research, game studies kind of academia. I would say I think the professional education is fairly connected to and has fairly good communication with the industry, and that the sort of PhD research level tends to have much, much less strong connectivity to industry.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess I'm curious, like that's the sense I've gotten to is is that unusual for industries like for Boeing or car makers or whoever, are people who ostensibly are solving the same problems or the same design problems? Like, do you know if in other industries they reach out to the more research-driven or PhD-driven, the sector of the same work?
It all depends. I mean, part of the whole job of academia is to be separate from industry.
This is true.
in some sense, it makes sense for them to be separate. It's also usually the job of academia to be both reflection-oriented and future-oriented, neither of which are things that industry has much patience for.
Yeah.
And so it depends. I think you've got industries that are just naturally reflective when it comes to process and are future-oriented, and then you have ones that are less so. So I don't look at it and say, wow, this is really weird compared to other, the relationship between other industries and academia.
Yeah.
It seems about normal, especially given the fact that the games industry changes very fast and very radically. Academia, because of its reflective nature, tends to change less fast and less radically. So it is a little hard for these two things to stay in touch with each other.
To sync up, yeah. So given that, like, yeah, I would agree, the game industry does move pretty quickly, and I know this is something you can speak to, given your time at Disney, and you can talk to, making entertainment for a mass audience. Like, if the game industry has access to incredible technology and they're able to move very fast, why do you think that so much of their output is still like shooting galleries or sports games and driving sims?
Well, because those things work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole idea is you want to make stuff that sells. So they make stuff that sells.
Yeah.
Those things sell. If those things stop selling, they'd stop making them tomorrow.
It's just that simple.
So, it's that simple, man. It's the market. It's what the market will bear, 100%. It's not that people don't try crazy stuff. People try crazy stuff all over the place. Most of it doesn't work because people don't want crazy stuff, mostly. They want some crazy things, but you don't know which one. So that when you try crazy stuff, you're taking a big risk. But, how many versions of Doom can we make? Apparently quite a few.
I think we're finding out, yeah.
Yeah. And you keep thinking, well, people will get sick of this soon. But, no, not really. It's like, how many love songs can you write? Quite a few.
Yeah.
We haven't had a year yet where the world has said, no love songs on the top 20 this year. We've had enough of those. But no, people like what they like. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, don't you think that, Nintendo proved you can sort of broaden it a little bit, and you can still make games of that scale, not just for that same audience, though?
I'm not sure I'm following you. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, I just mean, since the Wii, that's kind of always been what they've done. But you don't necessarily see, Sony or Microsoft taking cues from Nintendo in, trying to branch out in other directions. Unless, what are the sort of really crazy things you're talking about that you feel like you've seen the industry try, even if it didn't work out?
Oh, my God, crazy. Okay, sure. So, Electronic Arts spending $40 million on Majestic. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
We're talking about EA. EA is not known for really, really crazy moves, and they certainly did that. Or think about Spore. That was a pretty crazy one for them to do.
Yeah.
That was pretty far out there. I certainly would argue that Microsoft took a big risk putting the Kinect out. Same thing, Sony with the PlayStation Move. Those were kind of weird, experimental things to try.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, people try a lot of experiments, and some of them stick, and some of them don't.
Mm-hmm. Are there No, you're fine. Are there types of crazy risks or things you'd like to see more of from that space?
Oh boy, I don't know. I feel like people try weird experiments every day. It's always exciting to see all the new experiments. One of the things that's really blown that up has been, it used to be, if you're going to sell, you had to sell into the retail space. Now you can sell into the download space, and that has vastly increased the innovation, because people have been able to try kooky things like Journey or God. There's so many just crazy things that you wouldn't try if you had to sell it in a $40 package for retail.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. I almost feel like we're sort of overwhelmed by innovation at this point.
Well, so I'm curious. I know you didn't really mention the book that you've done, or the books, but how do you feel game design and the medium has changed since design got codified?
I'm not sure design's been codified.
Well, there's inroads towards at least trying.
Yeah, people now have better rules of thumb, and we have a little more language for talking about it.
Yeah.
One of the things that's good now is that just game production in general is less sloppy. It used to be everything was always late all the time, and every project was a terrible risk, and that's less true now, which I think is good. People are, now that we have kind of better process, it allows for more opportunity for experimentation, and a greater chance that your crazy experiment, you're going to find a way to get it shipped and out the door. So I do think that better production process has been a great help that way. Yeah, I don't. When I think about has this had any? The other thing is I think it's allowed for larger, what I'd call more symphonic games to get created. When everybody's swapping, you don't know what you're doing. You can only make games of a certain size before the whole thing just collapses in on itself. Things like, say, I don't know, even things like, say, GTA 3 was like a real kind of step forward in this regard, or like the Uncharted games or Last of Us. Like, these are games that have many, many people working on them, have very bold, strong vision, and are able to reach it and achieve it because of a combination of strong vision, excellent grasp of design principles, and rigorous production practices. You weren't able to get these sort of big, high-quality symphonic games done even, sort of 10 years previous. So that's certainly a big change that way. I think the other thing that's helped is the fact that now there are more books and guides to game design. It's a little less mysterious, and it's more accessible to. It's helped make independent game development much more possible because it's multiplied the number of confident independent game developers, which has allowed for a lot more interesting experimentation.
This may be a weird question to answer, but I mean, do you have a sense of how your book impacted that?
It's hard to know for sure. I mean, I certainly get I hear a lot of anecdotes from individuals who for them, it was the book that kind of gave them an entry into the space, and it made them, it gave them enough sort of confidence and tools that they could kind of jump in. Whether they would have jumped in 4 months later anyway, I have no idea. But certainly some people seem to have felt its influence, and so that's exciting.
Well, so I wanted to ask you a little bit about the talk you did a while back with the Hello Kitty game.
Oh yeah.
So I'll just pose the question that you asked, which was, what the hell is wrong with us? You were talking a bit about how even that game, meant for kids. Am I remembering right? Wasn't your child crying about that, or?
Yeah, no, that's right. No, my daughter was, I want to say she was 5 about then, and I had the idea that, this will be cool. This will be her first console game. And what could go wrong? Hello Kitty Roller Rescue. What's the worst that could happen? And she definitely, it started out innocuously enough. You're picking, outfits for Hello Kitty, and so I watched her do that for about 15, 20 minutes, and then I went out of the room to answer the phone, and I came back about 10 minutes later, and she was in tears, because once you kind of picked out all your clothes and your magic wand and you went outside, you were expected to beat all these cute characters to death with your magic wand. That was the whole point and object of the game. And she was absolutely furious at this notion, and she was crying, and I came in, and she threw the controller on the floor, and she looked at me, and she said, "Hello Kitty doesn't fight." And it's, yeah, kid, how can I argue with that? That was kind of embarrassing.
So how did we get to this point? I mean, where even something like,
I think it's just laziness. I mean, it's physical. Games need to have challenges to overcome. We like them to be emotional challenges. So emotional challenges usually means overcoming some other character, and physical confrontation is the easy way to do that. And so there you go. Now, there's a little bit of an extenuating circumstance with Hello Kitty in that the game was originally created for the Japanese market, where Hello Kitty is not strictly viewed as a children's entity. It's a little more of an all ages kind of IP, but still, that's kind of extreme. But that's just kind of what it comes down to. And I went through the same thing when we created Toontown Online. We very much had a vision that there'll be some kind of conflicty fighting stuff, but we don't want everyone to have to go down that path. We want to create a path where you can be creative and express yourself creatively and have that be your path of growth in the game. And we couldn't make that work at all. And we had a couple other ideas for kind of non-violent growth paths in the game, and they didn't really work. And ultimately, combat is your main kind of quest path through the game, because it was the only one that we could really make work given the circumstance and everything that kind of in terms of what an MMO requires. We found it necessary. So and I think this is the thing that's true in games again and again. If the business model drives everything, and for given business models, there's usually a limited number of sort of paths that actually work and are profitable. It's why we certainly can see it in the free-to-play realm right now. We see the energy mechanic and we see match threes all over the place. It's not just because people are copying each other. It's because people are trying stuff and they see what works. And it's sort of shockingly narrow. Sometimes the paths that actually work and make money, but it can be really disturbing. I just played Bullet Train, and I'm still creeped out from playing that game.
What creeped you out?
Well, if you'd like to know what it feels like to be a mass murderer in a subway station, that's the game for you. That's what the game is. You stand in a subway station, you have a gun in each hand, and you try and optimize for how many people can you murder with the gun in each hand. And it's an interesting challenge because we don't typically have a gun. Typically when we play video games, you have a single point of view. You don't think about I've got two guns that can point two different directions. But once you're in virtual reality, everything changes. And the fact that you're actually holding the gun in your hand and then just trying to optimize for, how many people can I shoot before they can come and take me away? It's if I was going to plan a mass murder, this is how I would rehearse. This is exactly how I would rehearse for it. And that's I don't think that's a very good feeling.
Last week, there was that school shooting, and I was contacted by a major news outlet, not really to make a comment on the record, but they wanted to just talk to me a little bit about, when these school shootings happen, what do you think about, when they try to draw connections to the fact that they played video games? And I talked with them a little bit about that, but I'd be happy to tell you what I told them. But what do you make of that when these types of connections that I think a lot of people very much into video games, I think they think those types of accusations are outmoded. But I was just asked about this last week. What do you make of that connection?
I don't think it's an unreasonable connection for somebody to make. I guess I don't look at it so much. I find it highly doubtful that there's a really strong causal, if the kid hadn't played video games, that he never would have tried this. But right. I can't help. But I certainly don't say, well, video games are certainly preventing this kind of thing. It's absolutely not pushing in the opposite direction, I don't think.
Right.
And I don't think it's at all unreasonable to suggest that these games, may grease the wheels a little bit of this kind of activity.
Right.
And so, I mean, the truth is we don't know. And I do find it, the idea that we live in a culture where it's now the cultural norm for 12 to 14-year-old boys to play these games that are about running through an area, you know, shooting down as many people as possible. That we now consider that a completely normal activity as part of our culture. I certainly find that disturbing. The question of mass shootings is really interesting, and you know, we don't have a lot of countries that have this as a persistent problem. And I guess you could argue that we don't either, because we don't really see it as a problem. We see it as something that happens, but it never occurs to anyone that maybe we should do something about this.
Yeah.
We just kind of observe it and move on. So I think the whole thing is fairly complicated, but
well, yeah, I mean, video games don't really exist in like a vacuum, you know. I mean,
yeah,
I'm sure it's true that, you know, this individual last week, I'm sure they drank milk at some point in their life too. Not to be flippant, but like, you know, who knows? It's such an individual thing, and
yeah,
as I'm sure you're aware of. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing I guess I'd say is that I don't think the problem is so much that these games exist. It's the problem. The problem is that we don't talk about them, and that we sort of, if we act like this is normal, acceptable social behavior, that's probably not great.
Yeah.
I mean, most people would agree, I think, that murder is worse than rape. And if you imagine that instead of murdering people in these games, every murder was replaced with a rape, how people would feel about that. And I don't think people would feel very good about that. But
there was a thing too, with Hotline Miami 2, which I don't know if you're familiar with that series, but
no.
There was a rape scene that turned out to be part of a movie that was being shot that you didn't know until you know, it's like the intro sequence to the game, and you didn't realize, like, oh, everything I did was part of a movie. But people were more upset about there being a simulated rape in a game than all the violence in that game.
Right.
And I feel like that comes up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that just says more about us than about.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Right.
So what does that say about us then?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we like and encourage brutal violence. I think is just sort of it's sort of central to our culture. And I guess I see games as more an unfortunate reflection of that than so much a cause of it.
Yeah.
Because again, I mean, it's what people want, and so it's what people buy.
So I don't want to talk at length about Gamergate, but I mean, I know that you've spoken at a lot of events, and I know that you know, you've been with the industry for a long time. I mean, have you ever had conversations with anyone in the industry or at companies now about, like, is there consideration for, like, you know, is there responsibility that should be taken for the audience that games have been building, or have you not really heard anyone talk about it as something that should be acknowledged publicly?
I'm not sure what you mean when you say take responsibility for the audience games you're building. I'm not sure what you're saying.
Well, I mean, so I'll tell you, like, for example, like, I've talked to some people who have worked on Grand Theft Auto or on Call of Duty, and just the general vibe is that they told me they didn't feel like the workplace was an appropriate place to talk about, like, just a lot of the death and rape threats and the doxing that's been going around in some corners on the internet around games. And so I guess, you know, when I say responsibility, I mean, like, you know, some sort of public acknowledgement or trying to get involved in the conversation in some way.
Mm-hmm. I get what you're saying. I mean, I guess I look at it this way. I mean, Gamergate is kind of a terrorist situation, fundamentally, right? And so you've got to choose how you're going to deal with terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always a tough choice, right? Because on one level, to ignore it makes it seem like you're saying it's not important. But on the other hand, to acknowledge it gives the terrorists more power.
Right.
So this is a difficult choice and a difficult conversation for people. I do think, I mean, certainly we've heard a lot about death threats, against women in the industry. I mean, I certainly know of many cases where men also receive similar kinds of threats and things.
I mean, was this going on in like the 80s and 90s as well? I mean, do you have memories of that?
I certainly know of cases where it was happening in the 90s. The 80s I kind of doubt. And again, the anonymity that the internet provided starting in 1993 really changed things. So in the 80s, I think it would be way weirder. Just because someone would write a letter. It wouldn't surprise me if a few cranks wrote letters. But the problem is now that terrorists can organize. The internet really allows for that. They can organize and they can kind of they can encourage each other, and so it's just one of the problems of kind of internet culture is that you have the worst people in the world can congregate and find a home and reinforce each other, and we just have to deal with it, unfortunately.
Yeah. But you don't get a sense like, I mean, I understand that the industry is in a difficult position, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, this happens in other industries too, right? Like don't people in the comics world also run into stuff like this, or at least that's what I've heard.
Yeah, I'm sure that in the movie industry, I'm sure that any place where you're kind of getting mass attention, you're going to have some amount of this. Now, I think the Gamergate one is strange.
Yeah.
I think the part that's peculiar about it is this notion that people have this. The Gamergate folks seem to have this perception that there's only a finite amount of game that can be produced. And right, and there was a time when a certain percentage of the industry was the kind of the games they like, and now they see that percentage is now smaller than it used to be, and it's just kind of a goofy, flawed logic, but it's kind of about sort of territory. You know, they feel like there's a territory and somebody's impinged on their territory. So in a sense, we're talking about really, really primal kind of stuff. And if you're talking about individuals who, you know, they've got problems and they have this one refuge in their life, and then they feel like the refuge is impinged upon, you can understand why they would go over the edge. I mean, it's certainly there's nothing healthy or about it, but like you can see how it could happen. And I think part of what it points to is how central these games sometimes become in people's lives, that they get so strongly emotional about them. One area where I'm seeing it is when Disney chose to shut down Toontown Online. I get continuous communication from that community that even though the game was shut 2 years ago, are still kind of actively finding ways to try and bring the game back because it means something to them personally. They connect with it, resonates with them on a really deep level. And that's a really interesting thing, I think, about games, that they can be that powerful.
Where do you stand on the edutainment brand for educational games?
Right. Well, about 2/3 of the games I produce are education or transformation games. And I guess I feel like there's tremendous power for games to serve educational and transformational purposes. the word edutainment has all this kind of funky, baggage with it. Because people tried a lot of experiments back in the 80s when CD-ROMs and things came out, actually 90s really, 80s and 90s. People tried all these experiments, and they made a lot of promises, and they couldn't meet a lot of the promises, and so as a result, the whole industry got this kind of just sort of a bad reputation. But one of the things that's really changed is the appearance of tablets has really, tablets are a pretty good platform for a lot of kinds of educational games. And so we're seeing a nice resurgence of that right now, and there's a little bit of, once bitten, twice shy kind of going on, where people are being a little more careful about making kind of garbagey content. There's still plenty of garbagey content, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, people are like, okay, we've learned a lot of lessons, we see what is and isn't working. And so I guess I sort of see educational games are something that's kind of climbing out of the muck and starting to become something that is having meaningful stature, and so bit by bit, I think they're going to be making a difference.
What sort of experiments and promises were made in the past that you were talking about?
Well, there was just a lot of flat-out bad content that was made, and there was a lot of content. We were talking about content that was maybe sold for, I don't know, people are spending $30, $40 for something that, say, it was supposed to teach you algebra or whatever, and it was just really not doing its job. There were a lot of these that were either they were really boring, or they weren't boring, but they were kind of interesting to play, but they weren't really teaching you anything. And so we just saw a lot of that kind of garbagey, kind of snake oil content, because it's really tough to make something that is both meaningfully engaging and meaningfully educational. It's just a really difficult design problem. It can be done. It's just really hard.